my privilege and honour to welcome the Reverend Professor Sathi Clarke to deliver his third lecture here, and he's going to be speaking obviously on Jesus in Hinduism. So welcome to Professor Clarke, and welcome to you.
Thank you, Karma. Thank you. So I'm going to start us off with a meditative bhajan. It's called a bhajan. It's an invocation of the Triune One. In India, basically what we would do is I will sing and then you will sing after me, but that will take a whole 10 minutes for us to work that through. So I will actually sing it. Take a posture of prayer. I will mention the name Yehovah, which you probably know, Yehovah, Yeshu, and Tuyavi, which is pure or Holy Spirit. And you'll hear the word Sharanam, which basically is refuge. It's really a way of gathering and taking refuge in the movement and the rest of the threefold principalities that we say is God. Now, I'm doing this when we're talking about Hinduism because most of this bhajan, as they call it, this way of actually invocation comes from the Hindu tradition. And just like we have the Trinity, they basically have what they call the Hindu Great Trinity. So the Great Trinity basically is Brahman, Shiva, and Vishnu. And that's usually three of their main deities. But let's take a posture of prayer. We'll enter into this mode and think about the Christian Trinity as we seek refuge in Yehovah, Yeshu, and Tuyavi. Yehovah Sharanam, 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 Yehovah Sharanam. Yesuve Sharanam, 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 Yesuve Sharanam. Tuyavi Sharanam, 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 Tuyavi Sharanam. Sharanam, Sharanam, Sharanam. Amen. So, what I'd like to do today is go through some personal musings because as I mentioned before, I grew up in India where about 81% are Hindus, about 11 to 12% are Muslims. Christians are only 2.6% officially, but unofficially is probably much higher. And then I will actually talk about Hinduism's developing need to contend with Jesus after British colonialism. And this the East India Company comes in 1600s. And then there is the British Crown takes over from 1858 to about 1947. And then what I'll do is very quickly give you three interpretations of Jesus from Hinduism from three very different perspectives. Ram Mohan Roy is from a rationalist perspective. Swami Vivekananda is much more from a mystical, a unitive perspective. And Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi is somebody you know basically as Mahatma Gandhi, which means Great Light Gandhi. And we'll look at these three interpretations. And then I will make some concluding comments about incorporating Jesus into the spaciousness of Hinduism. This is my father. He was bishop in Madras. He took over from a very famous missiologist called Leslie Newbigin. He was bishop of Madras from 1974 to 89. A very well-known evangelical figure. I'm sure at least you knew him and both of you knew him. A very charismatic, but a person that basically lived out the simplicity of the gospel based on his primarily growing up within the Hindu community. Simplicity and humility are very much part of Hinduism. So they're all trying to pray. That's my mother. That's my elder sister on the right. And I'm trying to distract them. So this is what theologians do. They mess up stuff that, in fact, otherwise is quite good. This was taken in Vellore, where my father was the chaplain at Christian Medical College for 5 years. Hinduism's developing need to contend with Jesus after British colonialism. So you must keep in mind that most of Hinduism didn't care about the rest of the world. They just wanted Hinduism for India. They just wanted to live a life. They want great missionaries going around. They didn't want everybody to be Hindu. They just said, we are India. This is our religion. This is our ancestral religion. Let us be who we have to be. And of course, in that incursion, there's into India, there is the British, and before that, basically the Muslims, the Mughal rulers actually were there from about the early 16th century. So there was all this incursion into India, even though they thought they were just practicing a religion for themselves. So this is a really interesting quotation by Habfas, who's a well-known Indologist. Discovering, fathoming, and interpreting other philosophical and theological systems was not a mark of traditional Hinduism. In traditional thought and literature, there has been virtually no interest in foreign countries, societies, cultures, or religions. India has not reached out for the West. It has not actively prepared the encounter and dialogue with Christian, European, or any other foreign countries. It primarily lived as though it was one whole community under this label that was given to it as by the British called Hinduism. So in order to understand what happened, so this self-contented and somewhat self-contained trend, however, underwent drastic change. It starts off with the Mughals, but I will talk about it from the 19th century with basically the East India Company and British Raj. So there are three factors that contributed to the new posture of modern Hinduism. The first was the need to fend off the colonial incursion on Hinduism by Western missionaries who proclaimed the moral superiority of Christian faith. First Protestant missionaries arrived in 1706, but it was only in 1813 that the British Parliament passed an act to allow them to come legally. Now, this is very interesting. See, colonialism was going so well, which is extracting of resources from India, by this East India Company. So the Parliament said, we don't want missionaries to go and mess this up. So keep in mind. So the first missionaries that came to India were sent basically by the King of Denmark. So they came in actually around because the British actually said, we're not sending. They sent chaplains. They sent chaplains to look after Christians who were working for the East India Company. So I say this because usually, sloppy scholarship just says wherever Christianity went, the flag and the gun went first, and then Christianity with the Bible sneaked in. Not the case in India. There, basically, the merchants came first. It was going so well, they didn't need the missionaries. The missionaries actually came in, and interestingly in India, they came in thinking that they will come with the highest castes and the very wealthy people. So it's like they thought the model was a lot like Africa. You convert the chief and everybody will convert. But it didn't happen. They started lots of education institutions. The higher castes never actually converted. Instead, the untouchables, those who were thought of as too polluted to belong to the human community, talking about 200 million of them, they're called Dalits. D-A-L-I-T-S, which means broken ones, crushed ones. And even today, if you go into any village within India, you'll find a caste village, and about 2 kilometers outside, usually on a dirt road, there will be what they call the colony, and where the Dalits basically live. Now, some of this has changed a lot within the city. In fact, we've also had a Dalit prime minister. We've had, a Dalit, twice we've had a Dalit as presidents. So there's a lot of education has helped a lot. And again, education because of the missionaries. So in many senses, the untouchables encompassed the mission and said, this gospel is for us, guys. You're missing the point. The liberation of who we are as thought of as being beasts. Now actually the gospel says, you are children of God. There's an image of God in each one of you. And you can live out that image with dignity. So that's what happens. So the missionaries actually come second and have to sneak in. And sneak in basically working with local communities. Many of us owe missionaries the idea of going and starting educational institutions in all of these places. Also, there was a rise of what is called Orientalism, which is basically what happens through this, and this is basically from the 19th century onwards, very well known, that knowledge was generated in such a way that everything was what is called binary. There was white, black. And associated with that then was white, rational, masculine, and black, emotional, feminine. So the idea of Orientalism was that in fact it is natural for white, rational, and masculine to rule over all things that basically was emotional, dark, and feminine. So that was what was generated. And what happened is because of this bias of a binary, all the libraries, even when we went to study in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, when we picked up the libraries, all of them had this particular binary within them. And Hinduism was thought of as being completely irrational. No one could understand. Who can understand 330 million gods and goddesses, right? Now, when we did this, we hid the fact that we had about 24,000 Christs running around different denominations, some of whom will never actually sit and eat with the others or share Eucharist with each other, right? We hid all of that. We pretended as though diversity and pluralism was only there and it had nothing to do with us. The third is basically, of course, reason-centered reflectivity of enlightenment that was coming into India. And you'll see the first person that we're going to look at is influenced a lot by that. We don't need to worry about the slide. Now, it's very important to understand the interest and interrogation of Jesus faded after India's independence from the British in 1947. Much of what I'm leaving with you is the way in which they had to encounter Jesus, because it came as a powerful figure basically with the missionaries and the colonialists. So they had to contend with it. And there was a movement of missionaries, conversion, so they had to contend. But from 1947 onwards, particularly in most of the mainline in India, they lost interest in Jesus. And today, actually, it's become a very dangerous situation. Hindu fundamentalism, which is called Hindu nationalism, has actually taken over all of India. And Christians actually are struggling to be involved with any form, not just of proclaiming the gospel, but living out the gospel for the sake of justice and liberation. Most of our movements that are working with tribals and Dalits, as I said, who work with them, they're actually being targeted by various parts, including violence actually against them. So there's a way in which Hindu nationalism has taken over, and Jesus actually has disappeared, and they're only worried about Christianity's influence in the country. And that's become a huge problem today. But outside of India, there were a lot of people actually talking about Jesus as a mystic, Jesus as somebody that's actually useful to you. In fact, these two figures, I have them up there. Yogananda, in fact, at Wesley where I taught, there were a lot of people actually influenced by Yogananda. And so every time they look at me, they'll ask me about not Jesus, but Yogananda. I was like, I don't know. I know Jesus, I don't know Yogananda. Right? But there was this, and then there was another very famous guy called Bhagavan Rajneesh. Lots of volumes about Jesus, actually. Come and follow. Lots of volumes about Jesus. But all of this is happening outside of the country, whereas from 1947, in general, Christianity was thought of as threatening in terms of the movement of vote banks in the country. Both Islam and Christianity basically were targeted. So let's get to the three interpretations of Jesus. So the first one is easy for you to actually understand because it comes from a very rational framework. And you can keep in mind. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy, he came from one of the princely families, and he dealt a lot with Jesus, but was also influenced by the Unitarians, and so wanted to lift up basically the godness of God, and interpreted Jesus basically in a way in which he is not fully divine. That was his purpose. So if you look at him, he said Jesus is the savior of men and women because he gave them moral precepts. Strangely, a lot of liberal Christians today are with Raja Ram Mohan Roy. For them, Jesus actually comes to deliver the ethics by which we can all be human, right? And so that's some of what happens. So he also is very famous for not just the religious movement, lots of reforms in Hinduism. So there was something called Sathi, not Sathi. Sathi means truth, which is what my parents actually had high hopes in me. So they made me truth. And of course, I went and married Prema, and that means love. And I tried for a long time to say, I speak and I say the truth, you just have to show love. She said, no, I think we've got to get this all reversed here. Right, anyway, I'm moving away. So the Sati was when women throw themselves into the funeral pyre, their husband's funeral pyre, because they don't want to take on widowhood. Because widowhood was thought of as very lowly. So S-A-T-I, Sati. And he actually started movements against this. He really was somebody who worked for rights of women very early. We're talking about, early 19th century. So again, much of what he did was really, he says, the consequence of long and interrupted research into religious truth has been that I have found the doctrines of Christ more conducive to moral principle, and more adapted for the use of rational beings than any other which have come to my knowledge. Again, he really thought that the Sermon on the Mount, the way in which we actually respect each other, we love God and we love each other, that becomes a very important part of what it is. Now, how does he look at Jesus? He preserves the sovereignty of God, but wants to harness Jesus' moral teachings for India. Again, his notion was Jesus, he said, was a dependent son. Look at the logic he uses. Has he not in his own expressed and often repeated that all the powers he manifested were committed to him as the Son by the Father of the universe? And does not reason force us to infer that a being who owes to another all his power and authority, however extensive and high, should be in reality considered inferior to that other? Surely, therefore, those who believe God to be supreme, possessing the perfection of all attributes, independently of all other beings, must necessarily deny the identity of Christ with God. Now, in this you can see Islam already is part of Indian fabric. He's also influenced there by Islam, who just say, let's stick with one God. And he's also trying to reform Hinduism that has too many gods and goddesses. And everybody is actually running around all these gods and goddesses. So for him, he actually wants to hold together this notion of one God and Jesus as the dependent one. He also looks at Jesus' unity with God was one of will, not of being. Now this is really important for him. So he doesn't run into the trouble that most of us have as theologians, to explain basically that in terms of the being of Jesus Christ, he was fully God and fully human. Now what does this mean? 51%, 51.5, 45, human in the head, sex organs male, and therefore lots of desire. We don't know what. So all of us are struggling with how do you do it if you actually put what was called the being or the ontology of God. So he said it's really simple. All that we need to do is Jesus' unity was one of will, not identity of 50% God and then 50% human, or fully God. There's no 50%. What we got over it to say fully God and fully human. So Roy uses Jesus' own words to debunk any sort of claim that he was equal with God or of an identical nature. When Jesus said, I and my Father are one, he did not mean oneness in the sense of being or ontology, but in terms of unity of purpose and will. Both basically came to announce, to advance the kingdom of God. And Jesus is so one with God, his Father, in that he wills to actually do the same thing on earth. And then, of course, he'll talk about Jesus as the firstborn of creation. So he accepts the pre-existence of Jesus with God. Thus, being the firstborn of creatures, Jesus is supreme above all creatures, including the angels. So he says that, yes, there is something about Jesus that we say is superior to every creation. And yet, basically, we can only say he's the firstborn of creation and not equal with God. So that's the rationalist part. That's the easier part. Now I'm going to turn your head in the opposite direction. Hinduism is not easy because its philosophical premise is completely different from Christians. So now I'm going to wake you up so that many of you will not sleep tonight. Your head will spin. It should spin because you have to understand Hinduism differently. So you can basically see that the three monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have somewhat of a similar worldview that we get. Hinduism and Buddhism, because Buddhism basically comes out of the philosophical structure of Hinduism, are very different. And I'm going to actually give you a sense of what is involved in terms of their worldview. So, this is what we have to understand. Hinduism's intuitive vision of all reality is one of what they call Advaita or non-two-ness. Okay, let it sit for some time. Non-two-ness is a form of monoism. There's a certain sense in which everything basically is one and similar in terms of what happens. So how do we understand this? This is intuitive vision. That all difference basically is difference because of space, time, and material. That's only the difference that you have. So reality, according to Hinduism, despite all its appearance of flux and change, is held together in an infinite, unchanging ground of being in which all things cohere, so that in the end, only God is real. So there's only one real principle, and that is God. So as different from, Christians basically say that God created human beings. But again, we don't know how to deal with it. We say God created human beings, then immediately the question is, what did he create out of? So if we say, there was some material, then there are two eternal principles. We don't know who's more eternal. Is it God or material? So Christians came up basically with this idea that God created ex nihilo, out of nothing. Hinduism doesn't believe that. They say, philosophically, God actually emanates all being from God's self. Okay? So all of us basically are an emanation of the one principle that is real, and that is God. Now, there is a form of Christianity that thinks of souls being eternal, and we always say souls go back and rest with God. For them, it's everything basically, the souls of animals, birds, everything actually that exists is part of that being that emanated and created being. Now, what is really important for this is therefore God, which is a transcendental soul, and human being, which is immanent soul, are separate but not different. We're separated from God, but we're not different from God. Therefore, all human beings are connected within the interrelated cosmos. We live within the divine and live out the divine. So, what for Hinduism is that in fact, okay, you may be white, you're a woman, you've got stuff going on, I don't have stuff going on, I'm a man, I have, whatever it is. But at the depth of our being, we're basically souls. And the soul that actually is part of you that is eternal is the same quality that I have. So that's why they always say, when Hindus actually wish you, they'll say, Namaste, which means I bow to the God in you. And they also then bow to themselves, and they bow to the gods in themselves, which is basically then all of us primarily are divine sparks. To give you an analogy, it's basically like we're all sparks that have come away from the eternal flame, which is God. So we may, as they say, we may be separate, but we're not different. Every being basically is part and parcel of what God is, and that's who we are. So one facet of this belief is that human beings live, move, and have their being in the divine. You may not be conscious of it, but this is who and what we are. And that is why for Hinduism, you don't need anything but knowledge saying, you, God, and the other are really one. Why are you making all these differences and trying to split everything? We're all eternal and part of that presence of what God is. The other facet of the belief that human beings have the capacity to mirror the true nature of the divine. So for them, actually, self-realization and God-realization are the same thing. Because, in fact, you are the spark that if you know, you will live out primarily that which you have been created to be. So that's really what the philosophical basis is. Now, this will help you understand a little bit of Swami Vivekananda. For him, Jesus as divine oriental descent of God, that's really what it is. And he actually has a whole chapter that talks about the Asiatic Jesus. So he says, many times you forget also that the Nazarene himself was an Oriental of Orientals. Within all your attempts to paint him with blue eyes and yellow hair, the Nazarene was still an Oriental. All the smiles, the imageries in which the Bible is written, the scenes, the locations, the attitude, the groups, the poetry and symbols speak to you of the Orient. And then he'll go on to say, Jesus as God. If I, as an Oriental, have to worship Jesus of Nazareth, there is only one way left to me. That is, to worship him as God and nothing else. Have we no right to worship him in that way? Do you mean to say? Now, this logic makes sense for them. You can't, Jesus is nothing but God, but the counterfact is that you also actually are nothing but God. He talks about Jesus basically as a giant wave in the ocean. Because there's something within him, the God realization basically shows us all who we can be as a self. So in general, that's why you'll find in this form of thinking, which is non-two-ness, everything is one, that's why most Hindus will have no trouble if you go and tell them, do you accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior? They'll say, of course we do. Can't be anything else. So you'll find a lot of Hindus, but they will say this, and then when they see another image somewhere else, they will also go and say, could you also take care of me? So they actually hedge their bets everywhere. But that's the philosophical basis, is that everything is basically deep down oneness, and that primarily is God. So this is again what very interesting for Hindus is that, so we have basically the idea of Christians usually think of when they talk to you about salvation is basically there's one hillock over here and there's another hillock over there, and there is a chasm between it, and we don't know how to get to the other side. So what we do is then we put the cross and say, you want to come over? Come. Walk on the cross and you can come over. This is the chasm in which you... Now most of that is basically then to create in human beings the feeling that, oh, I'm so unworthy. I can just, in my corner of my eye, I can see the glory of that land. But within me, there's so much yuck, it's not possible to do. Hindus have no such issue. So what they do is, instead of having this idea of a bridge and a chasm, they have what we'll say a theology of the ladder. Everybody in the world as human beings are at different stages or rungs on the ladder. And instead of basically trying to say, I'm going to pull you up, all that they need to do is through knowledge look at other things and say, geez, I've got to climb higher and higher and higher. This is the whole idea of self-realization becoming God realization. So climbing the God ladder in Jesus. That's how he would think about basically Jesus, right? This is again Vivekananda. You find that all these three stages are taught by the great teacher in the New Testament. Note the common prayer he taught. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and so on. A simple prayer, a child's prayer. Mark you, it is the common prayer because it is intended for the uneducated masses. To a higher circle, to those who had advanced a little more, he gave a more elevated teaching. I am in my Father, and ye in me, and I in you. Do you remember that? And then, so that's the second, the higher circle. And then when the Jews asked him who he was, he declared that he and his Father were one. And the Jews thought that that was blasphemy. What did he mean by that? This has been also told by your old prophets. You are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. Mark the same 3 stages. You will find that it is easier for you to begin with the first and end with the last. So what they look at as all human beings as within these phases, and he says, Jesus understood that. And that's why he made differentiations. That's one of the reasons probably he called only a certain forms of disciples, gave them the most difficult ethic, which is Sermon on the Mount, and told them, we'll see this Sunday, take up the cross and follow me. If you actually want to win something, you have to lose the self. It's a lot of ways in which these teachings, according to him, were lifted up, basically realizing that people are part of this theory of being on a ladder. The third is a figure called Gandhi. And most of you know, very influential figure across the world, primarily because he led Martin Luther King Jr. as well to learn about non-violence as a means of achieving what in fact was a higher life or the beloved community for all people. So Martin Luther King always says, from Jesus I learned basically the individual ethic. From Gandhi I learned how to use it collectively. This whole idea of quit India, non-violent movements that he led across the country. For Gandhi, Jesus was thought of as a martyr, an embodiment of sacrifice, and a divine teacher, but not as the most perfect man ever born. So he will say, what attracted him, understandably, was not the life of the church, but as he said, the gentle figure of Jesus, so patient, so kind, so loving, so full of forgiveness, that he taught his followers not to retaliate when abused or struck, but to turn the other cheek. I thought it was a beautiful example of a perfect man. But immediately he'll say, dear friends, I have your letter. I'm afraid it is not possible for me to subscribe to the creed you have sent me. The subscriber is made to believe that the highest manifestation of the unseen reality was Jesus Christ. In spite of all my efforts, I have not been able to feel the truth of that statement. Again, what he's working with is this notion that there is perfection or part perfection in all kinds of human beings all over the world. So he will actually work with Krishna and talk about Krishna. He will talk about Muhammad. He will look at different forms of perfections that also have some forms of weakness. He didn't want to accept Jesus as the only incarnate Son. Look at what he says. It was more than I could believe that Jesus was the only incarnate Son of God, and that only he who believed in him would have everlasting life. If God could have sons, all of us were his sons. If Jesus was like God or God himself, then all men were like God and could be God himself. My reason was not ready to believe literally that Jesus, by his death and by his blood, redeemed the sins of the world. Metaphorically, there might be some truth in it. I could accept Jesus as a martyr, an embodiment of sacrifice, and a divine teacher, but not the most perfect man ever born. His death on the cross was a great example to the world, but that there was anything like a mysterious, a miraculous virtue in it, my heart could not accept. In fact, in another statement, he says, I would rather go to hell than benefit from one drop of innocent blood that was shed. So he really didn't want violence to the platform in which, for example, we are redeemed. Again, the logic goes back to the non-two-ness. Everyone has the divine spark and is able basically to come to their own idea. It's another statement of this. But I just want to end with this, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, how do you actually work with incorporating Jesus into the spaciousness of Hinduism? So there are three things that we have to learn whenever we actually meet Hindus, talk with Hindus, think that we're presenting Jesus to Hindus. Keep these three things in mind. Since everything is a manifestation of God, there is no anxiety in Hinduism about the multiplication of deities. In fact, no deity, including Jesus, must limit, constrain such copious divine grace. Grace basically is strewn all over the world. And many of the Hindus that I talk to will say, you cannot make a case for me that God actually sat around and waited for a certain time and only went to a small group of people when 99% of the same human family that God itself created was sitting around till some white guys came and told us, oh, did you know God had a plan in Jesus? Right? So it doesn't make sense to us. Every culture, everywhere there are, if there is a form of perfection of God-man in Jesus, at least the traces of that should have been everywhere. Because then God truly loves everybody, not just making deals with certain people, right? So that's the logic that they work. And so keep in mind that they will accept your Jesus without any trouble. But to say, as Gandhi said, there is only one, is very difficult for them to understand because they have a plethora, because God actually constantly generates grace and meets us with grace in some form or the other. Why? The only principle by which God lives is love for what He has created and coming to embrace us to bring us home. And that has to be done in geographically 99.9% of the world and among 99.9% of the populations, if they were truly created by the one God who was created and needs to love and care for them. Second, Hinduism needs a religious mediator who can remove ignorance from the human mind rather than one who re-engineers and restores human nature. This is a very important point for a lot of Hindus. Hindus, it's very difficult to convince them that if they think we're all sparks come away from God, the only thing they need to realize is, yes, I'm a spark, I can live up as though I'm a spark. To go and tell them, no, the spark actually has been infected by, some strange virus and you're going to actually run into trouble because of that, that's not something that's easily understandable within their own worldview. So the beauty of Jesus Christ basically is something that they all accept. And we saw this in Gandhi, the gentleness, the humility, the love. But the idea that somehow you needed God to re-engineer each person, to recreate this God, is something that they cannot accept. If you remember, this is the same thing with Judaism and Islam. So Islam has a simple logic. Yes, of course, Adam and Eve sinned. But God didn't wait a billion years to say, okay, I'll come up with a plan to deal with this and send my son. God forgives Adam and Eve and says, if you actually repent for this, come back in and start living a life that in fact is beautiful for you, for your generations as well. So you'll see some of that within that. Third, any religious exemplar must represent the intuitive unitary vision of the revelation given to the ancient seers. So they are not able to see, and you'll find this basically in any of these religions that take ancestors seriously. You can't convince basically people that say our ancestors believed this is what in fact it is, to say no, your ancestors were full of BS. You can't do that. So for them, the ancestors actually hear this, and for example, their main scripture is called Shruti, which is that which is heard eternally. That which is heard eternally. So the seers, the gurus, they heard basically the fact that everything is one. Start treating each other as though you're divine. And think of your life as flowing back into the divine, Because in the end, it's only there that you will find fullness and rest. And for them, basically, the idea of salvation is merger. Merge completely into the divine. You're at complete rest. And that's really how you understand what it is. And what they'll argue is that all these Christians and these Jews and Muslims, this idea of basically going on and on is really part of the ego. But there is no ego. The only thing that is a spark within us is the divine. And it goes back. Just like when the spark goes back into the fire, it finds actually the fire glows more. And that's the logic they use in terms of what happens with Hinduism. So this is some ideas of basically the philosophical system of Hinduism and the different ways in which they understand Jesus. Which, as I said, is very different from how we generally think about how Jesus. So, for example, in a lot of my own my own life, and let's go back basically to where I kept the start to the end, just to give you an example of what is saying. So, when I was a pastor in India, I was always invited to Hindu homes. So I would go into the villages. For 4 years, I lived with the Dalit communities and serving them. So whenever I went into, and all huts, whenever I went into my Christian family and had a prayer, I would be dragged into all the Hindu homes and say, this person is sick, come and pray for them. Just this openness, a spaciousness in which actually they can accept who and what God is. I will tell you the story next week. I've actually done Hindu-Christian weddings, incorporating all elements that they would have liked for me. I've actually done, and that's what I'll share with you, I've done a Hindu funeral. A gentleman just died, and he told his children, I want Father Clarke to do my funeral. This is the first time that I've ever done a Hindu's funeral. But I've done lots of house dedications. I've worked across. There's a certain spaciousness in terms of what they would like, because they see within Jesus the humility, the love, the compassion, the grace, the forgiveness. All of that is seen within that. So that's something that, in fact, I've done a lot on among Hindu homes. Very open. Again, childhood, growing up, the only scuffs I get into when Hindus basically tell me when they wanted me on their side rather than the Muslim side, they say, you're just like us, you're not like the Muslims. I said, why? He says, see, you have 3 gods, they have only 1. We have 330 million. So just a multiplication of 3. It's all 3s, we all go in 3. So you're with us, you're not like them. So this idea of actually childhood, the ways in which we think about each other, and you will know this from India, everyone floated into each other's homes. It was all part of basically what and how we lived together. And again, my parents, it's really striking for me. My father, after he retired in '89, he moved to Australia for about 10 years, and then went back home for 3 years between when he was 79 and 83, and he lived actually among people. And he wouldn't actually distinguish between Hindus, Muslims, Christians. His wedding ring was actually given to a Hindu who wanted to have a surgery. He didn't even know the woman, but that's the way in which he lived. And often, actually, they lived in a flat. There was a Muslims, there were Hindus. The Hindus would always come before anything important, pray, and it will actually, for me, my heart pounded. Before they take leave, they'll prostrate before him, touch his feet, and then go. Now, the principle is basically, everything is actually part of the divine. Some people are higher on the ladder, hang on to them, maybe you can climb 1 rung or 2, right? And this idea of what happens within a society like this. As I said, much of this is actually being vulgarized by Hindu nationalism, just like Christianity has become co-opted and vulgarized by what we're seeing in the US. as Christian nationalism, the muscular form of Christianity, this Jesus that in fact all these Hindus actually were thinking about is not the Jesus that we actually see within this muscular form of religion. Same thing with Hinduism. It's become a very strident religion, and really zeroing in and focusing on Christians and Muslims and seeing that their work, their mission, their good humanitarian work will not be done in the country. So that's really what happens in terms of Hinduism. So there were a lot of missionaries that came to India, didn't know all of this. They would come and they will ask, so how many people actually give their life to Jesus, God, the only God that in fact can heal you and loves you? And everybody will put their hand up, right? And they'll go back to America and say, do you know what happened in India? Thousands of people accepted Jesus Christ. You know what happened. In many of the homes, particularly in villages, they'll have, along with different icons that they have for their goddesses, there'll always be Jesus, a photograph of Jesus, and also Mary, part and parcel of what. So it's actually a religion of assimilation, because it believes that actually everything manifests God. And everywhere you can sight God, you can see God, God shows up, and God actually sights you and embraces you. So that's the kind of spaciousness that you have in Hinduism. Well, I'll stop here. Any questions? Yes.
The Torah and the Bible and the Quran, do they have writing? Because that's the oldest religion, isn't it?
Yes.
They always have writing.
It was only written after Max Muller started actually coming down and getting it written. For a long time, what is called the Vedas and much of the Upanishads, which they have. So, as different from Judaism, the Tanakh, Christianity with the Bible and the Quran, theirs will probably fill a small library. It's all over the place. And most of it basically was only passed from word of mouth. And that's because they didn't want the Dalits to hear it. And they didn't want women to hear it because you'll pollute it. So they wanted to keep the purity of this. And even today, like we said, you cannot be a good Muslim and read the Quran in English or any other language. For them, basically, Sanskrit is the most important thing. You have to read in Sanskrit. So if you go into any Hindu temple, you basically will have, everything will be recited in Sanskrit. That's really the language that they use. So yes, most Hindus are quite ignorant about their own scriptures. They're very little. So there's one book that's taken the place of the Bible or the New Testament, and that's called the Bhagavad Gita. That's a short text, a very philosophical text. Some of it is very moving, some of it actually is a lot of gore. There's a lot of killing of that. But the Gita, as they call it, the Bhagavad Gita, is what is taken basically as what we can say is a functional scripture for most Hindus. Again, most of this, and I can spend weeks on this. So I haven't talked to you about this whole idea of caste differentiation. So every Indian is born into a caste. The Brahmin, you must have heard of the Boston Brahmins. The Brahmin is right on top. These are the priests and the teacher in class, correct? Then the second, there are warriors and rulers. That's the second, called the Kshatriyas. Then basically they are the Vaishyas, which is primarily the business community, right? And then there are the Shudras, who are the laboring caste, artisans laboring. Now, all of them, I told you, they emanate from God. So the Brahmins come from the head, the Kshatriyas come from the hands and the shoulders. The business people, of course, come from, stomach, making money off you and all of that. And the Shudras, or the laboring people, are the legs. The Dalits actually are thought of as not being human, so they don't have a part in this emanation of God. They're almost probably like beasts outside. they'll have to come in and become through births. So every Hindu is born into a caste, and you cannot get rid of the caste till you die. And after you die, depending on your good works, which is called good karma, you will be reborn. So the Hindus actually, when we tell them, will you actually, Christianity is a very loving religion, accept Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. They say, no, it's not a loving religion. If you don't accept Jesus, you'll only one life. They say, for us, we can keep going on 1,000,000 times till we realize and say, oh, we're really only spark. Let's get back into the fire. So they said, that's more grace than what you're trying to sell me. So I think I'll just keep working and wandering through life cycle to get into where I need to be, which is at the end, be with God.
Is that coming back as a human or coming?
You can be anything. You can be anything. So if you squash too many cockroaches, watch it. You could be anything. You could any life form. You could be. So it keeps going on in terms. Again, most of this is not logically worked out. So, I mean, the questions that everyone will ask me generally, good. So, what happens? Can a mother and son actually in the next life be husband and wife? So, all of these very tricky questions. How are you determined? Who is there a force actually determining what it is? But this idea is basically somehow your good karma will actually create something that's good for you. The bad karma will actually create something that's bad for you. Now, again, what happens is we don't think about the cycles of rebirth. But if you look around, bad karma will get you. It'll bite you in the where at some point, right? You may think people are really, you will have sleepless nights if you're sucking the blood of other people. It's not that easy. So there's idea, we think about it actually, somehow it happens here. Even those who claim grace of Jesus Christ and everything is okay, somewhere when something happens, they say, oh, what did I do wrong? Have I not been faithful? Have I not been prayed? So there's some logic actually in the human mind that works in these odd ways. So next week I'm going to say, how can we be Christian and what can we offer and what can we learn from other religious traditions? That's what it will work with next. Yes, Sam.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why do Hindus have so many gods? Is it because of openness? Or looking at an object, say for instance, fire is God, water is God, snake is God. Where does actually the concept come from? Why it is so?
So again, this is, if we believe that actually life forms are not only human, that any form in nature can actually reflect the one principle. There's only one principle. So every principle that moves and attracts you in a certain way to do something that's useful or good or beneficial is immediately named as part of this manifestation of who God is. Now, I've been a pastor and theologically looking at it. Christians have actually multiple Jesuses. Some of the Jesus that, in fact, for example, the fundamentalist Christians actually are after is exactly completely against what we think of as Jesus. So the idea actually of this plurality of trying to name and accept a divine is something that they have. Now, like all of this, right, it's mixed. Some of it is basically the God coming to you. Some of it is a delusion that only fire seems to come up actually just when it's dark. Maybe there's something that's in it. So some of it actually is just the mechanics of who we are as human beings. And we give it divine status to things that in fact are not divine, the natural. So I think it's a very mixed way of trying to understand it.
Thank you so much. Can we please thank Professor?
Thank you.
It's an absolute delight to have you here with us, and we look forward to our final session with Professor Clarke next Wednesday night, and it's going to be a very exciting one. So please do tell your friends, come along, and let's learn more. So
Thank
we
you.
really appreciated your
Thank
time
you.
and your grace.
Thank you for your faithfulness as well. Thank you.